It's just 5 past, so more people may come in. Thank you so much for being here this evening. Tonight we have a presentation about the National Register, and a second part is about the archaeological survey that was conducted last week or a couple of weeks ago. And the person who will be emceeing is the local project coordinator for this project, which is Bill Remsen. I just want to say that the Gloucester Historical Commission is very proud to be part of this, and our members are here. Holly Clay is here, Jude Seminara, Sandy Barry, Bob Whitmarsh, and of course Bill Remsen and me. If there's anybody else here, anybody? And we welcome you at our meetings, which are usually on the last Monday of every month in this building in the 3rd floor conference room. And we're always looking for alternates and advice. And I just want to say that this going on the National Register is a first step. It's just a first step that gives Dogtown a definition, a boundary, a status that makes it eligible for more state and federal funding for future projects. But the future of Dogtown itself is something that has to be decided in the future by the citizens of Gloucester and Rockport, by you all. And so this step that we've taken is just the first one. And so I will now introduce Bill Remsen, the local project coordinator.
Thank you, Mary Ellen. Good evening, everyone. So glad to see we have a good crowd here tonight. I just want to give you some ground rules about how this meeting's going to go. We're going to have 3 parts. The first part will be a discussion by Betsy Friedberg from the Mass Historic Commission. Betsy's the director of the National Register nominations for Massachusetts. After she's done with her presentation, there will be time for some direct questions to her relating to the National Register and what that means. After Betsy, we will have Kristen Heidert from PAL, who is the head of the Archaeological Survey team. She will present some highlights of their initial field work and discuss preliminary conclusions that they've come up with. After she has done her presentation, there will be time again for direct questions to her about what she is doing. After that's completed, we can have an open mic because we would like people to share their thoughts and their memories and information they have about Dogtown. We're very much trying to make this an inclusive process so people can come forward and be part of this whole thing. As Mary Ellen said, Dogtown is a special, special resource for Cape Ann, for Gloucester and Rockport. And it's used by countless people in countless different ways. What we're doing with this initial project does not change anything. Nothing changes. But it is a form of documentation. That's what we're doing. We were trying to document the cultural heritage in Dogtown and also develop a formal boundary of it, i.e. just not a fence or anything, but just like, what is Dogtown? It's been a big question. So anyway, without further ado, I'd like to introduce Betsy. Where are you, Betsy? Please come forward, Betsy Friedberg.
Thank you, Bill. I have 2 other staff members from Mass Historical Commission with me this evening. Ed Bell is the Deputy State Historic Preservation Officer and Senior Archaeologist, and Ben Haley, Preservation Planner, National Register Assistant. So the 3 of us are here representing Mass Historical Commission this evening, and we're happy to answer any questions that you may have. So as Bill said, I'm going to talk about the National Register program, what it is and what it isn't, and go through a number of slides that show images of places around the state that are listed in the National Register. But we won't be talking specifically, I won't be talking specifically about Dogtown. The National Register program is a federal program. It was established in 1966 as part of the National Historic Preservation Act. We have more than 75,000 properties in our state that are listed in the National Register, including about 1,700 National Register districts. So we are, depending on how you count, we're about second in the nation in terms of the volume of National Register listings. Each state has a state historic preservation office, and in Massachusetts it's the office that we work for, the Massachusetts Historical Commission. We were established in 1963 to identify, evaluate, and protect the significant historic and archaeological resources of the Commonwealth. Our chairman is Secretary William Galvin, Secretary of State, and our office is also the office of the State Historic Preservation Officer and the State Archaeologist. Now, Gloucester has a number of properties already in the National Register: 3 lighthouses, 24 individually listed properties, 5 National Register districts, more than 900 properties in total, most recent of which is the Rocky Neck Historic District that was listed a few months ago. I apologize, but I don't have a similar slide for Rockport. But I can just say that Rockport also has quite a few properties in the National Register, including both individual properties and districts. So the National Register program includes a wide variety of historic resources, and I'm going to show you some examples of those now. Downtown areas are listed in the National Register. Downtown Gloucester is in the National Register. Rural areas, such as Elm Hill Farm in Brookfield, is a National Register district. It includes open space as well as buildings. Residential neighborhoods are listed, and industrial areas are also listed. The National Register includes properties that are very, very old, such as this 1695 house in Ipswich, and some that are relatively new. The Haggerty House in Cohasset, designed by Walter Gropius, was less than 50 years old when it was listed in the Register, and it was built in 1938. Some properties listed in the National Register are open to the public or were built for public use. Others are more private, and here's another recent National Register listing in Gloucester, the Sergeant Robinson House. In addition to buildings, and most of what I will show you is buildings, the National Register also includes other kinds of historic resources, including sites, structures, objects, and districts. And these are 2 examples of districts. The Wendell Town Common is the buildings and the open space of the common in this community in central Massachusetts. And in Marblehead, the very, very dense Old Town is one of our larger districts in terms of the number of buildings and structures that are included, well over 1,000, but in a very compact area. And here's another National Register district, the Middlesex Canal Historic and Archaeological District, which includes resources for the entire length of the canal, which ran from Lowell to Charlestown. And it's largely archaeological resources, but it also includes some standing structures and a lot of remains. And much of the canal is not visible to the naked eye. Other parts of it are clearly visible. So National Register districts are ensembles, often a mix of buildings and structures, sites and objects that together form a cultural landscape and tell a story. Many of them you may have seen as you drive around the state are marked with signage, but signage isn't necessary. If a community chooses to put up a sign, that's great. And here's one example. Some properties are eligible for listing only in a district. The apartment buildings on the left are only eligible as part of a district, National Register district. Others, such as the Reeves Tavern in Wayland, are individually eligible for various reasons that I'll get into momentarily. Some properties are eligible individually and also within an eligible district. So, how to be eligible for listing in the National Register? In order to be eligible, properties have to meet at least one of 4 National Register criteria for significance, and they also need to retain sufficient integrity in order to be able to convey their significance, to tell us why they're special and worthy of recognition. And here briefly are the 4 criteria. Criterion A is properties associated with events and patterns of development. A school in Oakham is significant for the community's commitment to educating children. The 3-deckers in Worcester, a number of 3-deckers throughout the city of Worcester, were listed in the register, and this is a particularly fine, well-preserved group that have associations with immigrant history, social history, economic history, and patterns of development in the city of Worcester. Criterion B is associations with significant people, and they may be people of national importance. The Fitzhenry Lane house was listed in the register, and as I know you know, Lane is a nationally significant painter. The Ezra Carpenter House in Foxborough is significant for its associations with Mr. and Mrs. Carpenter, who made straw hats in the little L in this house. Their reputation probably didn't extend beyond the town of Foxborough, but they were significantly associated with this property, and the nomination demonstrates that. Properties may be eligible for their design and construction, and that can include architecture, and it may include works of master architects such as Frank Lloyd Wright. This house in Amherst, the Baird House on the upper left, is the only house in our state designed by Wright. The Captain Barry House on the lower left is a well-preserved Greek Revival style house associated with a sea captain, but it's also listed for its architecture. It's particularly well-preserved. And the Golden Hill Bridge in Lee is was an intact lenticular truss bridge built in 1885, was replaced within the past 25 years after it was listed. Properties may be also significant for their potential to tell stories about our past, and those stories may be related to resources that are not readily apparent with the naked eye. There may be information potential that may come to light in the future from resources associated with this particular property. That's most often properties that have archaeological significance, and we'll hear more about that in relation to Dogtown Common. But Richmond's Furnace is, like Middlesex Canal, another historic and archaeological district, both with standing structures, with standing remains, and with below-ground resources. Many eligible properties meet more than one criterion. In fact, most of them do, and that will certainly be the case with Dogtown Common. National Register nominations themselves are the documents that support the resource's significance under the National Register criteria, and that demonstrate that the resources retain sufficient historic character to be able to tell those stories of significance. And the nominations really are stories. They're telling why it is that a particular area is significant, worthy of recognition, and what makes one part of a community different from another and worthy of recognition. It really documents that. Here are two properties. The Colonel Ashley House in Sheffield was the home of Mum Bet, who was the first woman, a slave, to petition for her freedom in the late 18th century. And then the group of federal double houses in Newburyport, the National Register nomination for this district, which is another very large and dense district, talks about the maritime history of Newburyport and its architecture. Nominations for districts can include components that are constructed over a very wide range of time, and each nomination establishes a period of significance that is explained and justified within the nominations documentation. Here in Dalton, this district has a very broad range of significance that goes from the early 19th century into the 1950s. So the Old Stone Mill is important in the manufacturing history of this community in Cranesville. This is where paper was and is made. And the 1950s capes on the lower left, the cottages, were built using federal funds immediately after World War II for returning veterans, and are as significant in talking about the history of this particular community. Nominations for districts may also include properties that are termed non-contributing, either because they were built relatively recently after the period of significance, or because they're historic resources that are vastly altered. So in this photo, the building on the left, the bank building, is from the 1970s. The building on the right is from 1860s or 70s. So the building on the left was non-contributing in this particular district in Sheffield because the period of significance ended in the 1950s. Generally, properties should be 50 years old or older in order to be considered contributing. Time does have a way of marching on. So if we had a lot of time, we would go back and redo or expand the periods of significance for many districts, and it's possible that that bank building would become contributing because we're now 50 years past 1970. The nomination itself is made up of a number of parts, and I know it's hard to see here, but there's the cover document, which establishes the context and describes the resource and discusses the National Register criteria that apply, the themes under which the property or properties are significant. There are supporting documents such as maps, and there are photographs, and then there's something called the district data sheet, which for a district lists every single building, structure, site, object, resource of any kind that's within the boundaries that are proposed for nomination and designates whether they are contributing and non-contributing. So there are lots of different pieces that go into a National Register nomination document. So in order to be listed, properties have to be significant and they have to retain integrity or their historic character, but they don't need to be perfectly preserved. This district in New Bedford, the Acushnet Heights district, includes buildings that have undergone a number of changes. There's siding of various sorts. There's some window changes, porch changes. These are all houses built for workers who worked at the nearby mills at the bottom of the hill. Together, the rhythm of the buildings is readily apparent. They read as historic resources together. None of them are particularly outstanding, but as a group, they reflect the history of this area and retain sufficient integrity to convey that significance. So properties need to be significant and they need to retain their integrity. They do not need to serve their original purpose, and the National Register has no oversight over use of properties either before or after they're listed. The Beacon gas station on the left, listed in the Register about 35 years ago, became an ice cream parlor. This was one of a number of gas stations built around Boston in the early 1920s to resemble the State House dome, and there are about 5 of them surviving. The Kendall Green Station is still there on the train tracks in Weston, but it's been a residence for many years. You can't buy a ticket there, although apparently years ago the woman who lived there would sell coffee out of her kitchen window. Properties listed in the Register don't have to be open to the public, even one day a year. In fact, many properties that are listed in the Register are not known to others to be listed. In fact, the owners may choose to keep that quiet. It's up to them. A National Register listed building doesn't have to be painted in particular colors. This one in the National Register district in Chatham is a good example of how you can go wild, whatever you wish. I wanted to stress that the National Register district is not the same as a local historic district, and I know everybody's been given handouts, and this is always an important one called There's a Difference that you may have, that explains the difference between a National Register district and a local district. They're two very different entities. So what we're talking about tonight is a National Register district established through the National Park Service as a formal recognition that a group of properties is significant and worthy of listing and measured against set criteria that I've described. There is, as Mary Ellen mentioned, there may be review of projects that use state or federally funded permits or federally funded funds, license, or permits. There would be some opportunity for comment, and the review would come through Mass Historical Commission. But property owners using their own funds may do whatever they wish with their own properties within any other local bylaws and ordinances that are in effect in your community. Local Historic District is a designation that is established by 2/3 vote of City Council or by town meeting, and it's the one for which there's a design review committee established, and property owners who are within a designated local historic district who propose changes to their property must come and get a certificate of appropriateness before they can proceed with the change. And so it brings the opportunity for local review when changes are made to exterior features of buildings. Whoops, sorry. So the National Register recognizes properties that are worthy of preservation, but it doesn't guarantee that listed properties will be preserved. And among others, that Golden Hill Bridge that I showed you, the Lenticular Truss Bridge, is no longer in existence. It was proposed to be reviewed, be removed. It was a state-funded project. Our office had the opportunity to review that project, and ultimately there was no alternative to replacing the bridge, and the project to replace it moved ahead. So what are the benefits of listing on the National Register? And again, amongst your handouts, there's a sheet that explains a little bit more some of the benefits. But one of them is honorary. It's a point of pride that within a community, there is a property or a group of properties that are worthy of recognition. National Register designations can be used for public education, for heritage tourism. There are opportunities, as Mary Ellen mentioned, for funding assistance, particularly one is the Massachusetts Preservation Projects Fund, which I know that this building has benefited from. That's received grants through MPPF. CPA, Community Preservation Act funding, can be enhanced by National Register listing. And National Register nominations are a planning tool. They're a way of explaining and defining for you and your community and your neighbors and future generations that there is something special and worthy of recognition and protection and preservation that is in your community and makes it special and unique and gives an opportunity for it to be taken into consideration as your community plans for the future. So here are some signs that some communities do post for National Register designated properties. We don't give out the brass plaques. They're available for purchase from various manufacturers. We do give a paper certificate that's suitable for framing when you get to the end of the process. An education tool. One program is the Teaching with Historic Places program, which was funded in the past through the National Park Service and the National Trust for Historic Preservation. It's a program where National Register nominations are used as the basis for teaching tools, lesson plans that teachers can use, even if they can't visit a site, to work on a particular theme. For instance, the boot mills in Lowell are a subject of a teaching module that uses the National Register documentation to talk about social history and industrialization. Many communities have used National Register nominations as a focus for walking tours, and in Lowell they took all their National Register district nominations and condensed them and made them into brochures that are available as a resource for walking tours. Now you'd use one of those things that you can use through your iPhone, but these little brochures were done about 15 years ago. As I mentioned, there are opportunities for funding that can come through National Register designation, and the Massachusetts Preservation Projects Fund, which is a matching grants program, offers funding for properties that belong to municipalities and nonprofits. And here are 3 examples of projects that have benefited from those. And it's not simply buildings, it can be landscape features as well. And then, although this wouldn't apply to Dogtown, there are opportunities for investment tax credits for substantial rehabilitation of income-producing properties only. And then a planning tool. As we said, it's something that is a document that identifies what it is about a particular area that makes it special and worthy of recognition and worthy of preservation, and can help as you plan for the future. Northampton State Hospital is one example of a number of the state hospitals that were closed in the 1980s. A number of them were listed in the National Register at about the same time they were being closed, and many of them meant that large pieces of land with many buildings suddenly became available to communities for use. And Northampton State Hospital was one that undertook a long planning process. A few of the buildings were preserved, most of them ultimately were not. There were no alternatives that were found to demolition and replacement. But the documentation of the National Register did help to guide decision making. The Rockland Public Library is one of a number of libraries that proposed an addition using state funding, and again, there was the opportunity to review that project and to see whether it would be possible to bring that library into more of the late 20th, early 21st century in terms of its facilities, while at the same time maintaining the historic character of this little library, and that was a successful project. And then a state roads project around Falmouth Village Green that would initially, as proposed, would have taken part of the green. There was the opportunity to review that project and to find an alternative that maintained the historic character of the green while at the same time achieving the traffic needs that the community faced. So, why do I keep punching the wrong button? Sorry. So I just wanted to stress that achieving a National Register designation is a joint effort that takes community working together with consultants and with MHC staff to work together to come up with this document and to complete the project, and that's what we hope will be happening in Gloucester and Rockport with this project. So I will stop here. I don't know if people have specific questions about the process or whether we want to move on to the... Okay.
I just wanted to say that the Gloucester Historical Commission and the City of Gloucester and Rockport are very appreciative of all the efforts the Mass Historic Commission has done for us. They've been extremely helpful. Michael Steinitz in particular helped us with starting this whole process. He's not here tonight, but I would like to thank them, and I'd like to thank Betsy for her presentation. Thank you. Now, if anyone has any questions, please put up your hand. Yes, sir.
Yes, I have a question. Where this is clearly kind of an open space, undeveloped area for all practical purposes, with very few structures. Most of your slides are about structures. Are there many examples, not of town squares where it's open space or a farm, but are there many examples in Massachusetts of this type of district? You didn't show any examples of them.
That's true. There are some that are listed. The Middlesex Canal was one. Another one I could have showed was the Haywardville district in Stoneham, which was a settlement that is now part of the Middlesex Fells Park. But there are certainly other open spaces that are listed in the National Register and are well eligible, clearly deserving of listing. And we feel that Dogtown is such an example.
That's what I was looking for.
Yeah. And you'll hear more about that shortly.
Yes, ma'am.
What's the current status as far as development goes of that area? Is it in an open space thing, that no residential or encroachment?
Which area?
The whole Dogtown area.
Well, I can't speak to the specifics of, yes.
That's a detailed question, much more detailed than the scope of work that what we're talking about. It's an important question. Dogtown is owned by lots of different entities. There's city land, there's public, there's private land. There's all kinds of things, so there's no simple question. But I think to follow up perhaps in what you're asking is, nothing is going to change. Whatever zoning controls what's going on will not change. Any changes in use would be done by the City of Gloucester and the town of Rockport. Any more questions? In the back.
Are there resources to support to develop educational tools should Dogtown be identified as such? We teach preschoolers and third graders out there and we funded to do so.
In my experience, National Register nominations have been used directly in the classroom by communities, by teachers, not necessarily funded to use them in the classroom, but just as another tool. The Teaching with Historic Places program doesn't have funding that goes with it. They still are looking for additional lesson plans, I believe, and encourage the development of those lesson plans, but there's no funding that comes with it. So I don't know whether the communities would have money to invest in using the nominations in an educational way or not. Not through us, no.
Yes.
Dogtown common communities are known to be heavily industrially used. We cut big holes in the ground to move granite out. There have been multiple generations of logging activities. There were industrial activities related to railroad short stretches. All sorts of things have been going on out there. The concern is that folks like me were looking forward is whether the two communities of Gloucester and Rockport could not end up restricting the future industrial uses for, not in a horrendous sense of people might think of, but for instance, we're living in a very wind-rich part of the Commonwealth. Would we be planning out for the next umpteen generation of our share about climate change goals by having up there 10, 15 large turbines that are making money for our communities? Would we be in a position to put up there pre-colonial arboretum as a tourist attraction. We would be able to put up there teaching apps, public venues to get married in, have outdoor concerts or something like that. Or will they be freezing us in time for the basic reasons, a few cellar holes, and let's never ever touch this again, because some people, from what I've heard out of various groups in this town, they don't necessarily plan on this ahead. It's usually looking back, and we're freezing things in time rather than saying, you know, the spirit of Dogtown has always been one of use and progress, and using it again, very different types of uses, living in there, logging, cutting stone, etc., etc. So I'm concerned that some of this is sort of in the pretty historic, it's always good, rather than saying, you know, let's keep the doors open, because what are we going to find? Once you have that designation, and you're accepting any kind of federal funding, for instance, suddenly your limitations are growing, what you can and cannot do. And I haven't heard yet, that you're here on tonight, I have not yet heard this run up to this evening that whether we'll have continuously open community, municipality-owned industrial use of it. Not to dump junk, not to start a lead smelter, but for instance, a wind farm to make money for our tax base to be used. Tax cost.
I'll say something. As I said already, any changes in use would be done by the city of Gloucester and the town of Rockport. They control this is only in public land. I mean, in public land. Private people are controlled by the zoning code. Any changes would be done by the local communities. So it's really up to the people of Gloucester. I mean, it's Gloucester, through its planning and zoning, will control the future. But we're not talking about the future of the use of Dogtown tonight. All we're talking about is this project which documents the cultural heritage and defines the boundary. I think it's a very important question, and I think all of us are interested in that. But that's in the future. That's not tonight. Any more questions? Yes, sir.
Can a structure or building whatever it's going to be registered fall off of the register because it can be because
That's a good question.
Technically, properties can be delisted if they've lost the characteristics that led them to be listed in the first place. In our experience, we have done almost no delisting. We spend hours and hours and weeks and months working on National Register nominations moving forward, and the process of delisting is as complex as the process of listing, so that's very low priority for us. But in theory, a property that's lost the characteristics, the character-defining features that led it to meet the National Register criteria could be removed.
Any more questions? No? Oh, one more. This is a very good question, and just as an aside, you wouldn't believe the amount of material that has been collected for Kristen. I mean, maps handwritten maps, published maps, you name it, and everyone's got a different boundary for Dogtown. So one of the tasks that Kristen and her team have is to try to put together a reasonable boundary for Dogtown. And it's really great that she doesn't live in Gloucester because she's an outside third party, so we can't, you can argue with her. And so anyway, the answer is we will see. She will tell us about it. Anything else? Oh, another question. I believe you are correct. Any more? Okay, yes.
Just a correction there. It may be in the Babson watershed, but that certainly doesn't prevent entities from doing things in the watershed.
Well, whether or not they're allowed to do it in the watershed, I mean, we're all drinking that water, so I think the watershed protection is critically important.
No, I agree with you.
Yeah.
I was the Watershed Protection Committee chairman in Rockport, and I work at Blackburn Industrial Park, which is in the Babson watershed, parts of it. So clearly, political entities can make changes even if it's in the watershed, which much of the Dogtown is in Rockport or Gloucester's watershed, that does not give it de facto protection even at the local level.
You raise an important point, and it's above my pay grade to comment on it. Okay, I think if there are any more questions, okay, one more question.
Quick question: is there anything about this that is sort of unprecedented? When you're coming from the National Historic Register and Mass Historical List, in terms of it being conservation and the size of it. So what I'm trying to do is foresee any problems that might take place, because this is new. It is something that might be used for the National Register.
I don't feel that it's new. It's a challenging project involving two communities, and the boundaries are the greatest challenge at this point. But as I mentioned, there are other districts we've done that are similar, like the Haywardville district in Stoneham. So I think we've had experience with it, and we're ready for the challenge, and we wouldn't be embarking on this project with both of your communities if we didn't feel ultimately that it could be successful, would be successful. Yes. Yes. Yeah.
Okay, Kristen, it's your turn. Come on up. Kristen Heidert and her team from PAL, Public Archaeology Laboratory, will now talk about what they've been doing.
Excuse me for just a minute. I'm going to try to get this presentation up. I want to thank everyone for such a great turnout and coming out on this blustery Wednesday evening in November.
I'm not an IT guy. I just want to tell you to put the mic in front of your mouth.
I'm just trying to get this projector.
Who's our IT?
Not me, but do you have your program up?
Yep. Oh, you know what? Let me go grab the Let me go grab the.
Okay. Tap out of press. Oh, you know what? This has to be changed to, with my glasses.
Different format.
To a different, I need my glasses, different source. This is going to be computer 2. How do we, whoops.
So
That'll do it.
with the technical matters and stuff, I can say that one of the important goals we're really interested in is, all right, I'll try to speak even louder. Can you hear me now?
There's a microphone right here.
I usually don't use these things. So one of the things we are hoping for in this project is that the local knowledge that you've got, like important stories, important places out there that you know about, that you care about and you're interested in, is that the researchers from the PAL be very interested to get your contact information if you'd like to speak with them. Because in this particular forum, you might have stories or photographs or objects or things you remembered that people have told you that they're very interested in. Because one of the most important things we think about this whole area is that it's especially important on the local level. So we know that you've been out there, you've seen things that are interesting, and so those are what we want to know about. And Kristen has left a stack of her business cards over there that you could pick up one and contact her afterwards. All right?
Well, while I wait for this to fire up, my name is Kristen Heidert. I'm with the Public Archaeology Laboratory in Pawtucket, Rhode Island. We are a cultural resource management firm. We've been in business since 1982. We do above and below ground surveys, archaeological sites, standing structures. We've worked all throughout New England and the Northeast, as far down as Virginia, actually. We've also worked in Puerto Rico and in the Bahamas. I have, the rest of the team is sitting in the back of the room. Gretchen Pinio is our architectural historian, and she will be critical for the sort of looking at the non-archaeological resources and helping develop the actual boundaries and documentation for the district. Diana Doucette is a prehistoric archaeologist. She'll be looking at the prehistory of Dogtown and Cape Ann in general. I am trained in historical archaeology, so I will be looking at the very colorful history of Dogtown and all of the different contexts and themes that we're going to be exploring as part of this. So I want to start the general presentation for the evening. I'm going to start with discussing what PAL's project scope and goals are for this project. Then I'm going to do a little bit more formal introduction of the PAL team. I'm going to let you know what work we've completed to date. And then I'm going to talk about what the next steps are for us going forward in all of this. So we have been tasked with doing the National Register nomination documentation and an archaeological reconnaissance survey for this parcel, which is, in my readings, anywhere from 3,000 to 5,000 acres, depending on who you talk to. And as a part of that, we have to produce a detailed cultural and historical background for the parcel, and that includes its prehistory and its historical context as well. That includes the collection of a tremendous amount of information about archaeological research that has gone on there, historical research that has been done, primary and secondary histories about Cape Ann, Rockport, and Gloucester, all of the legends and lore that surround Dogtown, the mystery of Dogtown, I like to think of it sometimes as well. And as part of this, looking at the different themes and contexts for Dogtown, using those themes and contexts, we have to establish a defensible border, district border, boundary for Dogtown. And that is going to be based on the historical resources that we find out there and also the archaeological resources as well. And again, we're going to be producing the National Register documentation and the Archaeological Reconnaissance Survey report. These two documents are going to sort of work together. For example, there will be elements of the National Register nomination or there will be contexts and themes about Dogtown that we are not going to be able to include in the National Register nomination for any number of reasons, including there are no resources within Dogtown that have been identified yet, but that we still want to talk about as being important to Dogtown. That information will be incorporated in the Archaeological Reconnaissance Survey report for the property. And another thing that this has been stressed repeatedly by Bill and by Betsy as part of this is a first step in documenting the property, documenting the cultural heritage of the property for the purposes of preserving, for future planning goals, and to possibly preserve this property as a resource for Dogtown and Gloucester and Cape Ann in general moving forward. I want to mention that the funding for this project has been provided by the Massachusetts Historical Commission Survey and Planning Grant Program, which is a federally funded reimbursable 50-50 matching program, and it's designed to support just these types of historic preservation planning activities in communities throughout the state. And the matching funds for the Dogtown project have been provided by the Dusky Foundation. And again, as both Betsy and Bill and Mary Ellen have stressed, this is a collaborative project. There have been a lot of different partners that we have been dealing with even in these early days of this project. And we just had this kickoff meeting for this project on October 20th, I want to say, was when we had it. So we're still very, very early in the process. The final documentation is going to be developed by August 2018, so we have a while to go. But even in this early phase of work, we've been working with a lot of different organizations, including these municipal and state organizations, most notably the City of Gloucester and your mayor, who've been very supportive of this, the Town of Rockport, MHC, Gloucester Historical Commission, and the Rockport Historic District Commission and Historical Commission have been fantastic. The Dogtown Advisory Committee has been wonderful. Mary Ellen and Mark Carlotto have been very active in all of this. Rockport Rights of Way Committee as well, and the Gloucester Open Space and Recreation Committee. We've been working with local and regional organizations who've been providing us with a lot of great information and providing us with their concerns. Friends of Dogtown, Cape Ann Trail Stewards have provided trail guidance and some fabulous maps. The Babson Museum and Historical Association, New England Forestry Foundation, Essex County Greenbelt, Mass Audubon, and the Team Gloucester Running Club, which was not a group that I had originally thought was going to be involved with this, but they run around and see a lot of things. So they have been able to provide us with some great information about sites and resources that we probably wouldn't see because we're not literally running around Dogtown. And then I also want to call out individuals who we worked with as part of our initial field effort, who volunteered very graciously their time and their knowledge about Dogtown and provided us with tours of the property, which anyone who's been out there knows is much needed if you have no familiarity with the property at all. Mary Ellen and Bob Whitmarsh from the Gloucester Historical Commission have provided information, Bill Remsen, local project coordinator, Mark Carlotto, who I don't see here today, but I'm sure many of you know, has done a tremendous amount of work at Dogtown and was an absolutely wonderful trail guide for us out there on the Gloucester side of the line. Jim Ugoni from the Rockport Historic District Commission was with us at our startup meeting and provided us with a great deal of information. Mary Devaney walked with us the entire time we were out there. With your little dog came as well. Ivy came as well. It was wonderful. Tom Mikas and Monica Lawton from Rockport Rights of Way were also out there trooping through the woods, provided us with great information, showed us a lot of resources. Dina Enos from DAC was out, Dogtown Advisory Committee was out there as well. Nick Holland came to our startup walkover. Steve Whitey from Team Gloucester Running Club, who came to our walkover, and also we ran into him in the woods one day, he was running and he ran into us. Eric Hutchins, who's a Rockport resident and happens to also work for NOAA, graciously provided us with a tour of the Rockport side of the line from his property. Peter Anastas, who I'm sure you all know, we met at the Cape Ann Museum and gave us a lot of interesting information about his run-ins with some of the very famous artists who are associated with Dogtown. And then Stephanie Buck, who is the librarian and archivist at the Cape Ann Museum, provided us with a lot of information, and we anticipate working with her closely and with everyone in this group closely moving forward, and hopefully a lot of other folks will jump on the train as well. I'm sorry? We do not, but if you could provide me with some information about that, that would be great. So, just to review, so when you see PAL staff bouncing around, you know who we are and what we're doing. I didn't put my picture up because I knew I'd be standing here. Gretchen and Di, I did put their pictures on because I wasn't sure they were going to be here this evening. I am the project manager and the primary point of contact for this project. And any emails or information that you have, I have my business cards on the table. Please feel free to email me with any information that you have. As I said, I'm going to be responsible for the research and writing tasks associated with the district's history, to include in the National Register nomination and the Reconnaissance Survey report. And I'm going to focus on the historical resources and the archaeological resources of the property. Diana Doucette is a senior archaeologist. She's going to be exploring and writing about the environmental profile of Dogtown and looking at the prehistoric or pre-contact resources in and around Dogtown to sort of get an understanding of the history of the place before Europeans arrived here. And then Gretchen Pinho is our architectural historian. She has a vast amount of experience with National Register nominations. She's going to be dealing with the non-archaeological resources, although she's going to get dragged into the archaeological resources as well. And she's going to be looking at some of the things, the structures, the objects, trail networks, things like that that are typically included in a National Register nomination as contributing resources. And finally, Jane Miller is our GIS manager at PAL. She was not able to be here tonight, but she's going to be critical in developing the base map for this project. We are in the process of putting together a GIS-based interactive web map that we can look at the parcel and overlay various images and aerials, environmental data, so that we can see how the property changed over time, what the environment looked like, and what the resources are contained within Dogtown. And this is going to allow us to develop the district boundaries. And we have used this method on several very large properties in northern New England, ranging anywhere from 1,000 to 3,000 acres for cultural landscapes in northern New England. So, what have we done so far? This is a 4-phase project. We are wrapping up phase 1 of this project by December 8th, the end of next week. And as part of that, we are going to be developing the technical proposal to submit to MHC. We're going to be submitting a bibliography of all of the resources that we've explored. We're going to be submitting our base map, which is just basically a view of the property with preliminary boundaries and the different resources that we're going to overlay on the top of that. And I think that's what... And we're going to also be providing these meeting minutes and the public outreach component of the project. What we have done to complete the technical proposal thus far and the National Register nomination is we've started doing archival research. And as Bill has mentioned, and Mary Ellen has very generously contributed, we are awash in information about Dogtown right now, which is absolutely great. We have lots of project folders with lots of different types of information. We are developing our working base map so that we can define our district boundaries, and we've done a preliminary field survey to get a feel for the property. So for the archival research, the first thing we did was we looked at the MHC inventory form for Dogtown, which was completed in 2007. And it provides a summary history of the property and baseline boundary, resources, and significance information about it. And we've kind of used that to structure our thinking moving forward. We will be expanding beyond that area form as part of this project, but that kind of gives us a nutshell about Dogtown. We've also been looking at the Massachusetts Cultural Resource Information System, MACRIS, which is a publicly accessible online database developed by the MHC, and it contains all of the information on historic properties and areas in the Commonwealth. I should stress that the archaeological resource information is not publicly accessible. That is protected information. But any of the above-ground resources, historic districts, anything like that is available to the public, and I highly recommend people take a look at it. You can see a lot of things that are going on in your town, things that have been documented in your town. And it provides really important information about the types of resources in a community, historic properties in a community, and the number of those properties. In terms of sort of on-the-ground research, primary research, we're looking at previously published reports on the archaeology of Dogtown, and there have been some overviews. There's been limited excavations out there. The industrial archaeologist Roland Robbins dug out there at one point. In my experience working throughout New England, there were very few places that Roland Robbins didn't dig at one point or another, so it's always fun to find him again. We're looking at books, essays, and articles about the ecology, art, industry, the legends and lore, and the historical development of Cape Ann in general and Dogtown in particular, because you can't understand Dogtown without understanding the overall development of Cape Ann. We have a lot of historical maps and photographs that we're using. The maps in particular are going to be overlaid on our GIS-based maps so that we can have a sense about where resources were in the past relative to the current landscape. And we're also looking at a lot of municipal management plans for Gloucester and Rockport, specific to the towns, the city themselves, and also to Dogtown. And these are just a listing of several of the places that we have gone to or are planning to go to in the next several weeks. So far, we have been to the Cape Ann Museum, and we've been looking at a lot of online resources as well at this point, gathering information. But our intention is to go to all of the places listed here, as well as additional ones that we come across as we're doing research. In terms of the development of the project base map, as I said, I have gotten, we as a team, we've gotten information about Dogtown being 3,000 acres, being 5,000 acres. There's a lot of information out there. Those numbers are based on people's perceptions of Dogtown, what they consider to be important about Dogtown. So we had to start somewhere in terms of just having a general baseline map. So we are using the Cape Ann Trail Stewards maps, environmental and ecological overlays, developed by Nick Holland, as just a basic boundary at this point. You can see that it incorporates Babson Reservoir, Goose Cove Reservoir, the former commons, the uplands, some of the more, the important monumental stone features that are out there as well, the Babson Boulder Trail. So we have all of those resources captured in this boundary. This boundary may expand, this boundary may shrink, depending on what we identify as the important historical context, themes, and areas of significance for the property. So this is not a final boundary by any stretch of the imagination. This is just what we're working with at the moment. Another thing that we have used as part of the development of the project base map is the Dogtown Advisory Committee has an online web map that identifies a lot of the features and trails within Cape Ann in general, and a lot of it's focused on Dogtown as well. So we have overlaid all of this information on our project base map, so we can kind of take a look at what other people are identifying as important to them out there. And this is what we used for our field survey, which I'm going to be discussing next. This is a series of 11 by 17 sheets, tiled sheets, that are overlaid over the general district boundary that we established for the parcel. And when we were out in the field, we used this to record our photographs and record any new or different resources that we saw during the walkover survey. And this information is going to be, again, poured into our GIS base map, along with a lot of different layers as well, including the topographic quadrangles, the trail maps, soils, wetlands and water bodies, the contours. We're going to be using LiDAR data out there to see if we can track other cellar holes and stone walls that may not be clearly visible on the landscape anymore. Macris data, we're going to be using assessor's data from the City of Gloucester and the town of Rockport to see property boundaries, and then historical and contemporary maps and aerial imagery. So the other thing we've completed is our initial field survey of Dogtown. We did this on November 14th through 16th. And this was basically just a way for PAL to get their arms around the property, to walk the paths, to look at the most iconic elements of Dogtown, the most important features on the landscape, the most visible features on the landscape. I want to stress too, we did we did not do any sort of subsurface archaeological testing on the property, and we will not be doing this as part of this project. This is strictly a documentation project for the National Register, for National Register purposes, and sort of for an overall archaeological review of the property. So what did we look at? We saw Dogtown Common, and Mark Carlotto was, again, it's too bad he's not here tonight, he took us around to all of the foundations. We photographed all of Babson's boulders and all of the associated cellar holes. And we have photographs of everyone that we could identify in the field so far. We photographed Dogtown Common, and Dogtown Common also includes parts of resources that are now submerged in Goose Cove Reservoir, including the house of William Hilton and John Morgan Stanwood, his cobbler shop, also referred to as a boo, which is underwater right now and marked by a large carved boulder in the middle of the reservoir. We actually couldn't see the number on the boulder because water's too high, but when water's low or you're on the other side, you can see the number. Sorry? Yeah. Maybe this summer we'll get a good drought and go out there and be able to actually. Right. We also looked at all of Babson's boulders, and I have to tell you, personally, I had read so much about them and heard so much about them that every time we saw one, it was like meeting a celebrity in the woods. Every time I was like, ooh, because some of them are just shockingly large. And as I'm sure many of you know, Roger Babson was sort of the Warren Buffett of his generation. He essentially predicted the Great Depression and I think was able to pull his resources and not lose them all. Went on to form Babson College, I believe Wheaton College as well, several other institutions of higher learning. Like many extremely wealthy people, he was a bit eccentric and decided he loved Gloucester, he loved Dogtown, so he went out and decided to carve all of these inspirational sayings on these boulders using unemployed stonecutters during the Great Depression. His own family was very displeased by these activities. There are some very funny letters about his sisters and parents complaining that he's defacing all of these boulders, but he was very insistent. It made him happy, and he thought it was very important. Just goes to show, what was graffiti 100 years ago is now a nationally significant historic property. And then there are also stone features on the landscape within Dogtown that have not been touched by human hands, that are nonetheless incredibly impressive. We looked at several of these when we were out there. On the Gloucester side of the line, we looked at Peter's Pulpit and Whale's Jaw. And again, because I had seen so many paintings and drawings of Whale's Jaw, I was a little bit heartbroken when I walked up and saw the lower jaw snapped off. And then Eric Hutchins provided us a tour with the Rockport side, and we went to see Raccoon Ledges, walked up on top, which I don't know that I would do again. The other thing we're paying attention to at Dogtown is the artistic element of the property. Dogtown was an inspiration to some of the 20th century's most influential modern artists, chief among them Marsden Hartley. He went to Gloucester and Dogtown during a period of sort of creative depression and was reinvigorated by the property. And so what we're trying to do is find where some of his views were that he painted. And that's very difficult because Dogtown looks very different now than it did 100 years ago. So a good example of this is what you're looking at here is one of his famous paintings, Summer Outward Bound Gloucester. And Mark Carlotto, in his book, I believe The Sellers Speak, suggests that it may be this view between cellars 15 and 16 up Dogtown Road. And I was going through the exhibition catalog for Hartley's work, and I came across Blueberry Highway, which also looks very similar as well. So it's been a bit of a challenge to sort of reconstruct these views, and many of them I'm sure we will not be able to reconstruct, but we want to capture at least a few of them, both to illustrate how important the landscape was to Hartley and also to illustrate how much change has occurred on the property in terms of growth. Some of them are not difficult to reconstruct, that's fairly obvious. Whales Jaw is also, or Dogtown has also played a critical role in some very influential 20th century poetry. Charles Olson's Maximus poems are about Gloucester and about Dogtown, and he actually has some very evocative poetry about Whales Jaw itself. We looked at reservoirs while we were out there as well. The construction of Goose Cove and Babson reservoirs was critical to the preservation of Dogtown, conservation of that land. So we are looking at those resources as well. The Babson Dam is just lovely itself, I think. I just love the architecture of that dam. We walked around Goose Cove Reservoir. We walked above Babson Dam and looked down. We didn't actually walk the perimeter yet. We looked at granite quarries and motions, which I didn't know what a motion was until I was informed that during the walkover survey by Monica that this is a quarryman's term for a small-scale quarry pit. So we looked at a lot of granite quarries while we were on the Rockport side of the line, including Johnson's Quarry, which is still operational because there's a lot of machinery and structural debris left from the quarry operations that I didn't quite understand how it worked until I saw an operating quarry. So that's where we are with the process right now. We have a lot of information in front of us, and we're trying to review and synthesize that information into a series of contexts and historical themes for the property, which are going to help us structure the district boundaries and why the property is nationally significant, or why the property is significant on any number of levels, local, state, and national. So our next steps are to collate all that data. We plan on doing supplemental field survey. Once we get all of the research done, I'm sure we're going to have a bunch of questions about resources in the field that we're going to have to revisit. So we plan on being back up in Dogtown doing other additional walkover survey to document additional resources. As part of that, we're going to identify the contributing and non-contributing resources to Dogtown, and Betsy provided an illustration. They can be sites, objects, structures, buildings, and we'll likely have, with the exception of buildings, we'll probably have all of them in one way or the other within the Dogtown boundaries. And then we're going to do the National Register District nomination and the Reconnaissance Survey Report, which I gloss over and make it sound really simple, but that's going to be a huge amount of effort. And in closing, I just want to again stress the fact that we definitely consider this, we are approaching this and are very enthusiastic about this being a collaborative, community-based effort. And because Dogtown is so rich in history and has so much, interesting information and personal information associated with it, anything that you feel comfortable providing to Pal, to me, about the property that you think is important, I would encourage you to do so we can have that information in front of us when we're looking to define the district and identify its significance. Are there any questions? That's Shep Abbott's Dogtown map. Shep Abbott.
Kristen, I just want to thank you and your team. We're very impressed about how highly qualified and competent you are, and you're doing a great job. Now, let's just give a hand for Kristen. Thank you. And what questions do we have for her? Yes, sir.
To whom does the nomination get submitted? What is the process for being accepted or not?
Should we ask Betsy?
Betsy can probably address that.
So the nomination will be submitted to Mass Historical Commission and to the city. The project is due to be completed by the end of the summer of next year, so June to August 2018. We will then, the next step is that we schedule it for consideration by our state review board, and we'll be doing that. Our board considers nominations 4 times a year in March, June, September, and December. So we'll schedule it for one of those 4 meetings within a year of the date of the completion of the project. But prior to that consideration, we will send notification letters to the City of Gloucester, the Town of Rockport, the historical commissions in both communities, all property owners within the proposed nomination boundaries, and to all other interested parties. We'll also place a legal notice in the local newspapers. And there'll be another public informational meeting about a month prior to the review board meeting. I can't say exactly which of those 4 meetings it'll be, but it'll be within a year of the completion of the project. After the review board, their charge is to review the documentation and to say whether they feel the documentation supports the eligibility of the property for listing. And I'm sure that they will at that point. So they'll vote on it. Then we go over the nomination one more time to make sure the I's are dotted, T's are crossed, and then we send it to the National Register, which is administered through is part of the National Park Service in Washington, D.C. So we'll send the nomination to them. Then there's a 45-day review period, at the end of which they will, I am sure, list Dogtown. We're informed of it, and then we prepare a certificate and notification letters that go, again, to the property owners and to the municipalities, saying that the listing has occurred. So it's still a ways away to actual completion, but I guess I would say that sometime by the end of 2019, beginning of 2020, it should be listed.
Is there public input once it goes to Washington?
Well, there's the notification letters that we send to the property owners says that there's the opportunity to comment and to object if you choose to object. If the majority of private property owners, and we have no idea at this, I don't know how many private property owners there might be involved, but if the majority of private property owners objected, the nomination could not go forward. We do know that we have the support at this moment of the City of Gloucester and the Town of Rockport, who own the bulk of what we're talking about. The letters, though, invite comment by the date of the review board meeting, and that's explained in the notification letter that you'll be receiving.
So it's a subdivision of Park Service.
Yes.
To the 2 experts, follow on to my question, but future natural municipal uses of the 2 large areas between Rockport and Gloucester, could today, if you were now under the register of natural places or historic places, could you today build a Babson Reservoir or a Moose Cove Reservoir? Would that be allowed or would it be illegal?
You want me to try that?
Why don't you, Ed?
Yeah.
Ed, come over and use the mic.
I didn't train in opera. The kind of projects that you're talking about in terms of future development is really up to the Town of Rockport, the City of Gloucester, what they want to allow on their property, on their public property. And if the projects were assisted by the federal government or the state government, it's always a project that would be reviewed by either Mass Historical Commission or the federal government in consultation with other parties there. So at the end of the day, these projects usually proceed. What the review process is about is looking at alternatives in a way that would minimize or mitigate a negative effect on historic resources. So it's not a process that has a veto power. It's really ultimately up to the local government or the state government that's funding a project or permitting a project, whether they want to fund or permit the project. So listing in the National Register or not has no effect on what the ultimate decisions are about the use of a property. It just sort of informs the process to let people know that, hey, this area is important, or these resources within this area are important, so let's take a look and see what we can do about avoiding destroying them, or doing a project, redesigning a project in such a way that might avoid harming them. That's how that works.
Do we have any example of the other Massachusetts locations where something as massive as a Bristol Reservoir would be superimposed on a place of National Historic Register font? Because I'm interested in keeping this as wide open as possible. Nobody's going to project out of this tomorrow. That was already done 700 years ago. Last of big holes in the rust. The question is, what can our future generations do on that place to leverage, for instance, our wind-rich territory, or to enhance Rockport's water quality, because they have not had quite enough water so many summers in a row, depending when they go. So if they needed a bigger hole in the ground, so to speak, in order to store water, would any of this be in the cards? Because my concern is that you don't get something for nothing. And in the National Park Service finding, you see repeatedly that once you're in that system, it becomes a part of the federal government involved, what you do locally. When you take money from that source, for instance, for any feel-good thing, a couple of nice signs, a measure, some kind of improvement, something very rudimentary, you're going to be more and more in debt in terms of under control of more and more other people than the local municipalities. So my concern is to not constitute this kind of authority. But my concern is to not get too deep into a mindset that this is inherently a positive no matter what, when it may not necessarily be a good thing 1 or 2 generations from now.
Well, again, I think it's important to understand that the future of Dogtown is controlled by the city of Gloucester and the town of Rockport. If they want to do some different, make a different use, it's up to the community. Yes, in the back.
I have 2 questions, maybe they're simple. My first question is, what are examples of contributing and non-contributing resource, and what is the difference between the two? And the other question is, in that you have a grid system, and you have all the different objectives that we're going to try to identify in this map. Is it any easier when you're looking at Dogtown to identify public owned land? It sounds like it's going to be difficult for private owned land, but is it any easier to establish what the public is, and start with what we may know, and then you certainly don't know the specifics of the privately owned properties, but is it any easier to identify the public owned properties and then put that beyond that map so as soon as we look at it, we know it's private and publicly owned?
Well, I'll do the second question first. We do have the assessor's data from the City of Gloucester and the Town of Rockport, which is a layer on our GIS-based map. So we can look at that and know what's private, what's municipal. But for the purposes of the National Register nomination, or at least this point in the process, we're not really paying attention to those designations because the resources can occur on any type of land. And that goes to the contributing versus non-contributing resources. That distinction is contributing versus non-contributing will be dictated by a couple different things. What are the areas of significance that we're looking at? So if we are looking at Dogtown Common as an archaeological resource dating to the late 17th through the late 17th century to the 1830s. We're going to be looking at resources that within that area that contribute to that. So the cellar holes, trail networks, things like that. A non-contributing resource, and it's often more applicable to structures or buildings. If you have a particular area of significance and you have a building that has been altered or demolished to the point within a district that has a potential district that has been altered or changed to the point that it no longer retains any integrity, that is a non-contributing district, or if it's a modern intrusion on the landscape. Yes.
I noticed that on the tentative boundary
Mm-hmm.
which is an 18th century road.
Right.
There is a significant amount north of that that factors into particularly the granite industry heyday. So from the 1830s to about 1930s,
Mm-hmm.
when the granite companies went bust. And I'm wondering if there are plans to, we've almost got sort of two histories here. You've got the 17th, 18th, early 19th century settlements in the south, and then the quarry lands in the north. Are you attempting to capture both? Or are you choosing one or the other?
We're not choosing anything at this point. We're looking at everything. It's going to be, you know, developing that historical narrative and what makes sense. What's the most cohesive narrative that we can tell about Dogtown with those resources. But again, we looked a lot at the quarries, and as I said, that boundary on that map is strictly preliminary, and we have, that's in no way set in stone. We have every intention of looking north, looking south. We've moved outside of that boundary during our survey, looking at resources to the east. So yes, to answer your question, we're going to be looking at everything, but it's right now it's early days, so we're not quite sure how it's all going to shake out.
Actually, one of your contributing groups is the Marine Forestry Fund.
Yes.
And the
Norton Forest.
Farm, and actually the homestead there.
Mm-hmm.
The homestead goes back to the 18th century.
Right.
And Norton, of course, is planting in the 30s or about, so that might be
It is. It's a super complicated property because there's a lot of interconnectedness among the people and the use of that property over 2 centuries. So it's going to be a question of teasing that out and deciding what makes the most sense.
Yes, sir.
Yeah, in relation to the quarries in Rockport, particularly in the Lanesville side, historically, a lot of Dogtown actually, historically, its topography didn't change from 300 years ago. It's just growth that changed.
Right.
But Rockport, Lanesville, the topography has actually been changed significantly, if not in some cases hundreds of feet down and maybe 100 feet up in some cases. Is that all an archaeological resource or a structural? What actually is the quarry lands? Because they were all almost even interconnected at one point, like square miles.
Gretchen, what's a quarry? A structure? This is like the slag pile at Saugus Ironworks.
Cultural landscape.
Well, as Bill said, it's a cultural landscape. But from a National Register standpoint, how it would be, yeah, I would call it, because it's not, well, the problem with a quarry is there's nothing to dig. There's no soil for an archaeological site. What you see is what you get. So we would look at that more as a cultural landscape, an historical landscape, with those quarries as being contributing structures. And then there, I know we saw buildings out there, ruins of buildings out there as well when we were walking around the old steam building. What are they called? Boiler buildings.
Just one correction on that, which maybe wasn't pointed out to you in the quarry tours. During our major droughts, there was lots of stuff actually at the bottom of the quarries to dig for.
Oh, there was soil at the bottom?
Yeah, the stuff that all fell back in. Because as a kid, we used to go find old coins. They pumped the quarries dry. There's old railroad cars at the bottom.
The problem is there's no context from an archaeological standpoint. Stratigraphically, it's just in wash, so we can't associate it confidently with anything from an archaeological standpoint. So it's interesting in terms of the materials and sort of the accumulation, but that coin is not associated with that quarry. We don't know.
There's railroad lines that actually go down into the quarries, the railroad tracks, the railroad.
And those would be structures.
Old railroad cars that are actually, and then they've actually been buried in the
Right. Yeah. Right.
And rigging, the kind of rigging that you saw modern at Johnson's, where there's still some rigging to be seen. That was really all of the quarries were rigged like that. And we think that much of that rigging and the sort of cleats and so on and pulleys and whatnot, a lot of that was submerged when the quarries filled with water.
Well, at Nickerson's Pit, Mary walked us into the woods and showed us one of those riggings associated with Nickerson's Pit.
Mm-hmm.
we saw the cleats and all of that stuff associated. So yeah, it's a complicated question. We'd have to sort of get into it and look at the specifics of it. But for the purposes of NR documentation, it would primarily be viewed as a cultural landscape with contributing structures.
Any more questions for Kristen?
At the last Dogtown Advisory Committee meeting we were at, there was a lot of discussion of whether Cape Cod should be included. And have you done any preliminary surveys at that side of 127?
We did. We looked over there. We drove around there a bit. We're still working on how that's going to figure into the larger nomination.
Yes, sir.
You also have a grand pier
Yes.
all over Rockport. And it sort of fits in with what Phil was saying earlier, that it's sort of two parts. You use the word Dogtown, it sort of refers to the earlier colonial period. And then later, the Messer Road development of the port. And whether it's somehow linked or whether they're two separate things is.
You've identified our sticky wicket. This is what we're going to be dealing with Dogtown National Register nomination.
Any more questions for Kristen? Would anyone like to add anything about Dogtown, share some information or memories or thoughts? Yes, sir.
I just want to, Mark Carlotta is not here this evening, I guess, but hope I can make his ears tingle a little bit. I think the work that he's done has really been invaluable. I am at present the maintainer of the mailing list for a group of folks who hike every Sunday, mostly on island in Dogtown for Corrigan, but also sometimes on the other side of the town. And Mark's work has really made all of this tremendously accessible. And I just want to give a shout out. Both the summer seat is fascinating from a social standpoint and a historical standpoint. The island woods is absolutely invaluable to find all of the resources.
I mean, thank you. Mark has done an amazing amount of work. So many people have been involved in protecting and documenting Dogtown. It's fantastic. And I'm so glad that we can pull it all together and have it in a way that it's easier to share with everyone. So if anyone has further stuff, oh, another question. Here we go.
Yeah, on the pink sheet that I was reviewing that you handed out this evening that people got, where it talks, obviously, we start with private property owners, that's where people will make things. That's given on anything like this. I heard two different things. One on the pink sheet, and then one you mentioned on, and here it says the majority of property owners, so this is private property owners. You said in your presentation, the private property owners. Does the property owned by Rockwell and Gloucester count as one of those votes, or is it only the private property owners?
Actually, it's only the private property owners. So if the majority of private property owners, technically, were to object, the nomination could not go forward. If the town of Rockport or the city of Gloucester also came to us and said, we don't want this to happen,
Right.
it's foolish to try to move forward.
The reason I ask that question is it's going to throw a real interesting wrench into this, which is maybe at most in Dogtown, in the end product, probably at a large scale, still only 20% of this would ever be private property by definition. But 90% maybe in the nomination might not actually vote based on that definition. So, you follow what I'm saying?
Yes.
That's a very strange situation to be on.
It is.
Municipal entities don't actually get a vote.
That's also true in a residential district where you have one owner who owns 50 properties and another owner who owns one. They each have one vote.
But you don't get that.
No, but I'm saying there is a similar, in a way, an imbalance. But it's the way the program is set up.
An adjunct question there is a fair amount of the property that is neither municipally owned nor in private hands is under conservation management or outright ownership by the Essex County Greenbelt or the New England Forestry Foundation. You may
That's something we, they're they're nonprofit, so they do have a vote. There are some sort of quasi private, public, and we usually would ask our legal counsel for some decision on whether those are where they fall. Right. Yeah, those definitely would include, have the opportunity to vote. And let me also say that one of the reasons we want to have this sort of public informational meeting now and an additional meeting later and just generally to be available to answer questions is that we want to make sure that people understand what this program is all about, and so that we don't have a lot of owners who then at the end of the day say no.
When will be the next meeting or report?
The next meeting that Mass Historical would be sponsoring would be, or participating in, would be right before the nomination goes to the review board, so a ways away. But the local historical commissions are available to answer questions, and the consultants are going to be around and also can answer questions, and we're available. It's just that we won't be here physically, but we can certainly help answer questions. And our phone number is on the documents that we handed out.
Yes, go ahead.
The National Register nomination we will have a bibliography in that. Oh, I'm sorry. Overly casual. The National Register nomination will have a bibliography citing all of the sources that we have consulted as part of the project and any interviews that we have conducted. The reconnaissance survey report will address the resources that we did not make it into the National Register nomination, areas of significance that could not be justified within the district boundary, or resources that could not be justified within the district boundary, areas of significance. So all of the information will be available in one format or the other at the end of the project. So if the city of Gloucester and the town of Rockport have a desire to have archaeological survey work done out there, then a CRM, a cultural resources consultant, would have to be hired to do that work under an archaeological permit issued by the Massachusetts Historical Commission, and the work that we're doing now would inform that effort. We will be talking in the reconnaissance survey report about areas of sensitivity within the property, things to be concerned about, archaeological resources to be concerned about within the property. So yes, that would all inform any future archaeological work that might go on out there.
Yes.
One more. Let's say you come out of the technical review and have a line that's defendable, or at least you feel it's defendable, and it contains 100 parcels. Does the potential designation have to include the 100 parcels, or is there a strategic step on which of the 100 parcels is more politically viable to be acceptable, and how is that made? As a private landowner, I'd like to know when my, so to speak, input comes in to say nay or yay, or the person who actually would be saying keep him out, keep her in, to get a package that's passable. Where does that kick in? Or does it? Or does it have to be what you do? Do you see what I'm saying? Does what you determine as the district have to go all or nothing? Or is there a political strategic approach that kicks in before the submittal?
So the boundaries are drawn based on the resources, and so that's what the consultants will be coming to as part of their project. And that's one of the things that will be decided fairly soon in the first or the second phase of the project. We don't then go to the owners and say, are you interested or are you not interested? We move forward. And that's the intent of the program, that the resources are justified based on the historical and significance of those resources. So the property is defined by the resources, not by whether an owner wishes to be part of it or does not. So if a single owner were to object, but that doesn't constitute a majority, that property would not be removed from the nomination. It would stay in the nomination, and the objection would be part of the document that we send on to the register. So it's only, we keep track, and we're looking for a majority or a substantial minority of owners, but it's not uncommon to have 1 or 2 or 10 objections in any given district nomination.
But it would be possible to adjust the boundaries of the district to exclude those parcels, and it wouldn't detract at all from the cultural preservation because there are no resources on those parcels. Is that a viable way of moving the project forward if there are objections?
Well, we don't take a poll before we get to that point, and in a district of buildings, it's quite likely that these non-contributing features that we've talked about would be included. We don't want them to be on the fringes of the district, but within the center of the district, or there may be resources that are non-contributing. That may be the same case here, and I can't speak to it because we haven't gotten to that point yet. I suspect there may be some non-contributing features, but most of them are going to be contributing. And the boundaries will be drawn based on the concentration of contributing resources.
One more time, two experts. I want to get the final answer. Can Rockport Village be once and forever beautiful rich enough reservoir unincluded in National Park Service or not? Can Rockport do it or not?
Try to explain this again.
Yeah.
The National Park Service has no say in a project unless the National Park Service is doing the project. And the process for reviewing projects, it's not a veto power where the project doesn't proceed. The process is to look at the effects of a project on historic resources and then look at ways to avoid, minimize, or mitigate those effects on the resources. So at the end of the day, my experience in working with things is that the projects go forward. So it's not a case where something is yes or no, you can never build a project there, because that doesn't happen under the process. This is an honorary listing on there. And especially in a federally funded or permitted project, it actually doesn't matter if it's listed in the National Register or not. It doesn't even have any bearing on that. In a federal process, the federal agency goes and looks for resources that are important. It doesn't have to be actually listed or not. The process for environmental review is based on the involvement of a federal agency. So a federal agency, they might oh, I want to build a highway through Dogtown. I want to build a new expressway through Dogtown. So then the federal agency would look and say, oh, Dogtown, this is eligible and significant and historically important. So what's going to be the effect of our interstate highway that we're going to build through it? So that's how the process works. Does that explain it? Does that answer your question? Great.
Go ahead. Do you want to try that? Ecological resources.
As part of the National Register documentation, and in particular the reconnaissance survey report, we will be discussing the environment, the ecology, the land use history, but we are not biologists, we're not ecologists. We are looking at those factors as how they contributed to the historical and cultural development of Dogtown, but they would not be contributing resources per se, or non-contributing resources. Yes. Yes. Right, and we would be discussing people, if you're talking about the individuals themselves in terms of how they would be discussed within the nomination, they could be discussed as part of the developmental history, the artistic history of the property under criterion A, or they could be discussed under criterion B, which is about people. So there's a couple different ways that they can be incorporated into the nomination. That's going to be addressed as part of the, we're going to have a very detailed discussion of that as part of the reconnaissance survey report. Right, that would be considered as part of the National Register nomination, and regardless of whether that particular context makes it into the National Register nomination, it will be discussed in detail as part of the reconnaissance survey report for the parcel. I'm sorry, help with what? They are being done in tandem. The two work products are being done in tandem. So we will be talking about the prehistory of the property in either the National Register nomination or the reconnaissance survey report. We're not doing any archaeological excavations out there.
That'd be next, yeah. That kind of thing would be the next phase, or down the line. This is the first step, and so all kinds of other research can go forward. This will help that. The GIS map can be a base map for all kinds of work in the future, but that's not part of this project. And it would be great if these things could happen in the future. So unless anyone has anything else pressing, I'd just like to mention that if you have any ideas you want to share, or thoughts or questions, the Kristen's cards are over there on the table. Please feel free to contact them. I would just like to thank Mass Historic Commission again for being here. They will also be happy to answer questions. I'm sure you'd like me to say that. And we welcome the participation from all stakeholders and interested parties as we go forward to protect Dogtown. Thank you very much.